Good evening and welcome to The Big Question. I'm Sanjana. As the Prime Minister lands in Canada at any moment, this evening we're turning the spotlight on a diplomatic freeze that has left trade deals stalled, students stranded and billions of dollars in limbo. Can India and Canada ties be reset? And what's truly at stake in the relationship between these two democracies? This evening, we're asking whether the frost in India-Canada ties is finally beginning to thaw, and if it's even possible to go back to being business as usual. A year ago, a few would have imagined the extent of the diplomatic damage. A public accusation, a tit-for-tat over visas, trade talks derailed, and one of the largest Indian student communities abroad left uncertain about their future. But now something shifted. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is at the G7 summit, not just as an invited guest, but invited specifically by former Canadian central bank chief and new political heavyweight Modi-Carney. Is this a signal, a reset in motion, or papering over cracks that run deep? Because let's make no mistake, what's at stake here is more than politics. Canada's pension funds have invested over $55 billion in India's infrastructure and growth story. India exports close to $4 billion worth of goods to Canada each year. And more than 3 lakh Indian students have made Canada their second home. All of these students now face study permit cuts, delays, and a growing sense of insecurity. So tonight we ask, is it possible to turn the page? Who stands to gain or lose if we don't? My colleague Maha brings you a lowdown of what we can expect from this year's G7 summit, particularly regarding India-Canada discussions. Let's listen in.
Prime Minister Modi will be in Kananaskis. Before that, he will land in Calgary on the 16th afternoon, and he's expected to then head to Kananaskis, where he will not just be participating in the G7 outreach session, but also hold meetings with, most importantly, the Prime Minister of Canada, Modi-Carney. As you know, that there has been friction in the relationship between India and Canada, and therefore, this visit by the Prime Minister is being seen, which could act as an icebreaker. It could also lead to at least the thawing in the frosty ties between the two countries. What we will expect in the next steps, as of now, remains unclear as far as the diplomatic engagement between the two sides is concerned, considering that both sides do not have the highest representation of diplomats in each other's country, that is the high commissioners. However, we do know that both sides are talking about some intelligence sharing or a law enforcement agreement, considering that both India and Canada have had grievances against each other with regards to the issue of Khalistan, especially India, having raised that issue several times with Canada. And clearly, the friction between the two countries has been over that issue. As far as the business engagements really are concerned, or the economic gains are concerned, the fact that India is invited to the G7 summit, this is the 6th consecutive time, is because of its market size. India is a huge economy, and Modi-Carney, while defending his decision to call Prime Minister Modi or invite Prime Minister Modi, had said that India is the 5th largest economy, and it is part of critical supply chains, and that is why it has to be on the table as far as G7 is concerned. India has been called as an invited guest nation for G7 since the Biarritz summit in France in 2019.
My colleague Maha Siddiqui bringing us the latest from Canada. And to explore this further, we have a panel today that cuts across diplomacy, policy, and people. Let me quickly welcome them. Ambassador Meera Shankar, former Indian envoy to the United States, someone who has watched up close how India engages with the West and how these resets really happen behind the scenes. We also have Dr. Jayajit Bhattacharya, president of the Center for Digital Economy Policy Research, who brings insight into how political tensions ripple across investments, trade flows, and long-term trust, of course. And Kathleen Deroser, founder of Deroser & Daughters, and a seasoned Canadian immigration expert who has worked with hundreds of Indian families navigating a system that's now mired in unpredictability. So let's get straight into it. Coming to you first, Ambassador, is this a moment for quiet diplomacy, or have we moved too far apart?
I think that in diplomacy, you never say never. So I think it's an opportune moment to try to reset relations, particularly because for both Canada and India, diversification of both political and economic ties at this juncture assumes great importance given global uncertainties caused by US tariff policies under the Trump administration. And so I think it's something which both countries will probably try to do behind the scenes and step by step. I think the easy goals would be to reestablish diplomatic relations because both countries expelled diplomats from each other's embassies. Then they stopped issuing visas, and that has hit not only ties between the two countries, but also the large Indian Canadian population which has extensive ties in India. So, and of course, the Indian student population in Canada, which is also been impacted. So, I think there are a number of factors bringing the two countries together, including the fact that Canada is a resource rich country and India, as its economy grows, will be in the market for reliable resources from a diversity of sources.
So, Dr. Bhattacharya, while this political chill continues, Canadian pension funds have over $55 billion invested in India. How vulnerable is that investment to diplomatic tension, and can strong economic interests really act as a stabilizing force in such a situation?
The impact or the outflow of the friction that happened between Canada and India was largely in the geopolitical domain. It was not in the geoeconomics domain.
Sure.
If you look at the trade between India and Canada, there has been no stopping in the growth of the trade. It has been consistently going up. And as you rightly said, India and Canada are very, very complementary. Canada has a large amount of resources. India has the largest population in the world. In fact, since the G7 meeting is happening, India's population is 50% more than the total population of G7. So it's one of the largest upcoming market possible. And it's definitely not in the interest of Canada to be estranged with India as an economy. And similarly, the other way around, it's not in the interest of India to not be in good terms with Canada. So, and that has been the history. India and Canada has been on very good terms. If you look at the developments in terms of students not being welcome in Canada, I think that's more of a self goal because if you look at the balance of trade issue, India actually has a surplus in terms of services trade, which is about $10 billion. But if you look at the outflow of money from India to Canada through the student mechanism, it is Canada which is enjoying a surplus from India. So there are multi-faceted, relationship between Canada and India. And I don't think the direct trade between Canada and India ever got impacted because of the geopolitical tension. And I'm sure, given there are politicians on both sides who are very good in managing what essentially is a political issue, these will be papered out very, very quickly.
Excellent point there. And coming to the student aspect of it, I'm going to bring in Kathleen now. Kathleen, you've been working closely with Indian families navigating immigration to Canada. So with study permits now being cut, uncertainty high, what are students and families telling you? Is Canada still being seen as a reliable destination? I am thinking of the recent case in Ontario where a group of Indian students were told mid-semester that their permits would not be renewed.
So unfortunately, this has happened to the Indian student previously, but now after the G7 meet, it's a good news because we have already, as an immigration consultant and having my own consultancy, we did see a drop wherein the aspirants were taking back and withdrawing their applications, and they were not sure whether they would like to go ahead with it or not.
Sure.
And especially the Indian students. But now there's a relief, and there are new policies, new applications, there are new postgraduate work permits are introduced. Before the G7 was even, introduced, I mean, it was like coming into the picture. But before that, the Canadian government, as soon as the new prime minister came in, we see that there are new policies, and that was a new relief for the Indian students. So it's just not going to be cancelled the midway. And of course, with the right approach, with the clear documentation, and with the right approach, you'll be able to get through, and you will not be facing anything else the way you have faced before. And I am seeing a very good change in the client base, and people are now really happy with the change, because we're seeing in the RCIC portal as well, the immigration consultant, the certified consultant, wherein they keep on updating their news and kind of policies they are introducing, just like 19C bill. And the same way, they're going to have more bills for students like this. And of course, India is a cornerstone wherein the tech, construction, healthcare, people with a lot of talents are, going to be produced from India. And that is the reason it's going to be relief for the Indian students.
So as a follow-up, if I asked you whether Australia and Germany are now becoming more attractive because of smoother visa pathways, what would you say in comparison?
Australia, yes, because now they are opening up, because the Australian immigration year starts from July 1st. And of course, there will be new occupations which have been added, and most are from trade, and even the chef, oilers, motor mechanics, even they are welcome. It is an easier process comparatively to Canada, because the competition is really less. For Canada, since we have our own people, those who are completely established, they have their own business, and we have our own little Indian community staying there. That is the reason people prefer Canada over Australia and Germany.
Ambassador, if both sides wanted a reset, what does that actually look like? What are the first steps that would really signal real intent and not diplomatic optics?
Well, I think that both sides will have a discussion on issues which have, been the cause of the distance which has developed between the two.
Okay.
So from the Indian side, it is the feeling that Canada has not been responsive to our concerns on terrorist activities encouraged and sponsored or financed from Canadian soil, and incitement also to violence. Whereas on the Canadian side, there have been allegations of involvement of Indian agents in targeting Sikh extremists, Khalistani extremists in Canada, which India has denied. So I think it's important for the two countries to put in place some mechanism. It's not that this is going to be resolved in one go, but I think they can agree to put in place some mechanism which will allow them to deal with these issues on an ongoing basis. There's been some talk of arrangements for intelligence sharing and for law enforcement cooperation. I think that could be something. The first step would be, as I said, restoration of diplomatic ties, because if you don't have representation, you don't have an embassy at sufficient levels, then the ability of your mission to deliver or even to keep track of issues, I think, becomes much less. And then, of course, there's the stalled trade talks which were going on, but which were paused because of the tensions which developed between the two countries. I think that will be the next step after, you have reestablished higher diplomatic presence, and also set in place some mechanisms to deal with the differences. I think then resuming the paused trade talks could be one, and resuming the agreement on uranium supply, because in 2015, India had signed an agreement when Prime Minister Modi had visited Canada, for Canada to supply over $300 million worth of uranium to India. And as India proposes to step up its nuclear energy program, I think resuming these supplies becomes important. Working together on critical minerals, rare earths, etc., would be another question. And of course, as you mentioned, Canadian pension funds have been amongst the largest investors in India, particularly in the infrastructure, energy, renewables sectors, transportation sectors. And so from India's point of view, I think it would be important to convey, that our economy continues to do well and is a good place for investment. And if you noticed, despite the political tensions, trade and investment were not impacted. And Prime Minister Carney has shown that he's a pragmatic leader. He's been quite mature in the way in which he has handled questions on the tensions with India. He's also been governor of the Central Bank of England. And so I think that given the urgency for Canada in the face of US pressure to find diversified trade ties and economic ties across the world, particularly with reliable partners, I think there is a moment for the two countries to seize and to try to rebuild the relationship.
Dr. Bhattacharya, because I'm glad that Ambassador raised the trade negotiations aspect, because those were suspended abruptly last year, just weeks before a very planned ministerial meeting. Was that breakdown? I know we're saying that it's not so much a geo-economic divide or tensions like that, but was that breakdown likely to hurt MSMEs in sectors like, say, pharma or agri-exports, which rely on low-friction trade with developed economies? Because India has, I think I have the numbers here, India has exported over 30,000 crore worth of pharma goods and processed food to Canada last year.
Right, those are big numbers, but do keep in mind that Canada's GDP is roughly the half of India's GDP. Its population is a little larger than the population of Delhi. So, the market size needs to be recalibrated and the expectation needs to be recalibrated. But Canada is obviously a very important source of raw materials for India. And that is important for feeding the large industrial juggernaut that India is having, and at the scorching pace at which India is growing, Canada becomes very, very critical. And having a free trade agreement or the equivalent of a free trade agreement is extremely important for the reasons that you mentioned, that the global institutions have got weakened, the United Nations, the WTO, these have all become weakened. In fact, we do not have an appellate authority in WTO, which is being leveraged by many of the larger economies. And therefore, many of the structured guardrails against which the global trade was running, they have become very, very fractured now. So under these circumstances, I think it's more important for Canada than for India to make sure that there is a trade agreement in place. Because, for Canada, one of the largest markets, which was US, seems to be on very, very shaky grounds. In fact, the trade with US is coming at the cost of their own sovereignty, as has been very clearly laid out by the president of US. And as with most nations, sovereignty is something which is something that a nation can't compromise with. And if they do not have trade with the US, which is one of the largest markets, then which other markets can they reach to? And obviously, India becomes that alternative market. Even with US not veering towards the way it has veered, and with the institutions being in place, India was still a very, very lucrative market for Canada. And hence, it was very strange why geopolitical issues were picked up, which were basically non-issues. I mean, if Canadian terrorists are threatening India, then that's an issue that Canada should solve. Instead of solving that issue, they let it turn into a geoeconomical issue,
Sure.
which is very, very strange. Also, there is a issue of trust now because if as the ambassador mentioned, if the two embassies are restaffed, we are not really sure what the Canadian staff are going to do here because they have been continuously interfering in Indian issues, which is also a threat to our sovereignty. So there are multiple, very real geopolitical issues that needs to be papered out. The economics always is pushing the two countries together. I think it's geopolitics which needs to be resolved before we can have the trade agreements back on the table.
Absolutely. Kathleen, looking ahead, are there any quiet policy shifts that you're seeing in Canada that might open the door again for Indian students or skilled professionals, or are we bracing for a longer chill?
Of course, there's a relief for Indian students wherein we are seeing there's a great shift wherein we have introduced 1 year of postgraduate work permit started giving. And also for federal skilled workers program, which is one way to get your permanent residency for skilled workers, which was point based. And, initially when it was introduced in 2015, so a doctor, a healthcare professional was competing with a finance background. So anyone and everyone was in the pool, and based on their, not on the skill sets, but based on the points, they were getting judged and they were getting picked and getting their invites. But now, after introducing 19C bill, a healthcare professional will be competing with a healthcare professional. An educator will be competing with an educator itself. So now it is an ease for the skilled workers to get their work, to get their permanent residencies as well. Because Canada is one nation which gives you a permanent residency directly on your human factor, your age, education, work experience, and the language proficiency. You would have to write an English language test or a French test. So people, those who have a French, like they have a French skill sets, or they can speak French, or they can read and write with a normal Canadian level of benchmark 4 or 5, they can apply and they would be able to get their permanent residency within 6 months' time. The run is really less, and it is kind of a cakewalk for them.
So if we zoom out, then do you believe that student and skilled immigration flows can actually act as a bridge for diplomatic repair? Would you say that?
Of course, because they are good human resource, and of course it's gonna bring warmth, and it gonna be like reduces the unpredictability because of the visa processing and the engagement. It's all benefit.
Sure. Okay. I don't have too much time. I have about 4 minutes, so I'm going to just get a wrap, line or two from each of you to close. If I were to come to you first, Ambassador, what's one clear action India or even Canada must take now if this relationship needs to be salvaged?
Well, I think, as I said, to put in place a mechanism to deal with the difficult geopolitical issues on an ongoing basis, to re-establish diplomatic ties at a higher level, 3, resume people-to-people movement and visas, and then the rest will flow from that.
Okay, excellent. Dr. Bhattacharya?
I think India has made it very clear that terrorism is non-negotiable. We answered that with Pakistan, and we answered it in good terms. I think Canada should sit up and take notice and respond to the sensitivities of India. They need to cooperate with India in terms of intelligence, in terms of curtailing terrorist activities by Canadian terrorists. I think that's the first step that Canada needs to do, and automatically we will see reciprocity coming from India. I think we will have all the other positive developments following immediately.
Okay, all right. Kathleen?
I only have 2 things to say: that a diplomatic reset is equal to immigration stability.
Okay, all right. And I actually wanted to ask you one last question. What are students and families now telling you? Is Canada still being seen as a reliable destination, if I were to ask you in closing?
Of course, it has reduced the fear of disruption in the processing. So it has become again a hot topic and a hot country to pick for.
All right. Thank you so much to all of my panelists joining me this evening. This conversation is something that we will continue. Let's remember, the Prime Minister has just about, I think, going to be landing any moment. So we're expecting a lot more backroom diplomacy and also talks that we may see the chill between India and Canada. Now, 3 decades ago, India-Canada ties were defined by shared values. Today, they're shadowed by mistrust. But between G7 optics and back-channel diplomacy, there may still be a quiet window for repair. Because at stake is not just diplomacy, it's $55 billion in investment, the future of 3 lakh students, and the credibility of 2 democracies that need each other more than they may admit. Will they seize the moment or let silence do the talking? We'll keep a close watch, but for now, that's it on The Big Question. Keep watching.